I am Maya. I am 32 years old and a forensic accountant. I uncover financial fraud for a living. But the biggest betrayal I ever witnessed was not hidden in corporate spreadsheets. It happened on a Tuesday night while my mother gasped for air on my living room floor. My car was in the repair shop. I called my older brother Jamal, begging him to use his luxury SUV to get her to the hospital. Through the thumping bass of a nightclub playing in the background, he laughed. He told me she was a burden. He called our mother dead weight and told me to figure it out myself. I simply said okay and hung up. What he did not know was that his luxury car and his entire fake empire were legally controlled by me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. The sound of my mother struggling to breathe is something I will never forget. It was a sharp, agonizing wheeze that echoed loudly off the hardwood floors of my apartment. Evelyn was 64 years old, but in that moment, she looked incredibly small. Her hands clutched her chest, and her eyes were wide with a terror that paralyzed me for a split second. I dropped to my knees beside her. My phone was already in my hand. My mind raced through the options. The ambulance would take at least 20 minutes to reach my side of town due to the severe thunderstorm flooding the main avenues. My sedan was sitting in a repair shop on the other side of the city. Jamal lived only 5 blocks away. He drove a massive four-wheel drive vehicle that could easily navigate the flooded streets and get her to the emergency room in 5 minutes. My fingers shook as I found his contact. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping against my eardrums. "Come on, Jamal," I whispered. "Pick up the phone." On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. Instead of a greeting, I was met with the deafening roar of heavy bass and clinking glasses. Jamal was at a VIP lounge. I could hear women laughing, and the distinct voice of his wife Brittany complaining about someone spilling a drink on her designer shoes. Jamal shouted into the receiver asking who was calling him from a noisy club. I screamed into the phone. "Jamal, it is Maya. Mom is having a heart attack. You need to come right now. Bring the car. The ambulance is delayed and she needs to get to the hospital immediately." There was a long pause. The background noise muffled slightly, as if he had covered the microphone or walked into a private hallway. When his voice came back, it was not filled with the panic of a son about to lose his mother. It was dripping with absolute annoyance. "Maya, are you serious right now? Do you know how much I paid for this table? I am entertaining investors." I looked down at my mother. Her lips were turning a faint shade of blue. I pleaded with him. "Jamal, please. She cannot breathe. It will take you 5 minutes. I will drive the car myself if you just bring it here." Jamal let out a loud, exasperated sigh that made my blood run cold. "Listen to me now, Maya. I am not ruining my night for this. She is always having some kind of dramatic episode. She is a burden. She is just dead weight slowing me down." "Not my problem. Figure it out yourself." "Brittany does not want the smell of a hospital ruining the leather seats anyway." His words hung in the air. Dead weight. He called the woman who worked 3 jobs to put him through private school dead weight. He was concerned about the leather seats in a car he did not even truly own. A car that was legally registered under an irrevocable trust that I managed. But this was not the time for a financial audit or a lesson in legal ownership. This was a matter of life and death. I looked at the phone screen. The call was still connected. I could hear Brittany laughing in the background, telling him to hang up on the help. The rage that bubbled inside my chest was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was a cold, calculating fury. I did not scream. I did not cry or beg him again. I simply took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the phone, and said one word. "Okay." I pressed end call. The screen went black. I turned all my attention back to the fragile woman on the floor. I dialed the emergency dispatcher again and demanded immediate medical evacuation. The operator assured me the paramedics were navigating the flooded streets as fast as possible. I sat on the floor holding my mother in my arms. I brushed the damp hair from her forehead. I whispered gentle words of comfort, telling her to stay with me. and focus on my voice. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. The storm outside raged on, rattling the windows of my apartment. Inside, the silence was broken only by her labored breathing and the ticking of the wall clock. As I held her, I made a silent promise to Jamal. He wanted me to figure it out. I would figure it out. For years I had watched him take advantage of her generosity. I watched him drain her savings to fund his superficial lifestyle while I worked tirelessly to secure her future. I had built a fortress of legal protection around her remaining assets, quietly assuming the role of her true financial guardian. Jamal would pay me back. The flashing red lights of the ambulance finally pierced through the heavy rain outside my apartment building. The paramedics burst through the door with a stretcher. They moved with a calculated urgency that made the small space of my living room feel even tighter. I grabbed my wet coat and my purse, keeping my eyes fixed on my mother. They lifted Evelyn onto the stretcher and strapped her in. I followed them down the narrow hallway and out into the howling storm. The rain soaked through my clothes instantly, but I did not care. I climbed into the back of the ambulance. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, sealing us inside a moving metal box. The siren wailed above us, a deafening sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into my bones. The interior of the ambulance smelled intensely of sterile alcohol and damp wool. The space was incredibly claustrophobic. There were cabinets filled with medical supplies rattling against the walls with every bump in the road. The paramedics shouted medical terms to each other as they attached sticky monitors to her chest and placed a clear plastic oxygen mask over her face. The bright fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows, illuminating every deep line of pain etched into my mother's face. I sat on the small jump seat in the corner, clutching her cold hand in mine. Her skin felt like crumpled tissue paper. Despite the oxygen mask and the frantic beeping of the heart monitor, her eyes fluttered open. She looked at me with a desperate kind of sadness. She squeezed my fingers weakly. Her voice came out as a raspy whisper, fogging up the plastic mask. "Maya, do not be mad at your brother." The words hit me harder than a physical blow. Even now, lying on a stretcher with her heart failing her, she was defending him. She took a shallow, ragged breath and continued. "He is just busy with his business. He has a lot on his plate with those investors. You know how hard he works to make us proud. Do not hold this against him. He means well, Maya. He really does." I stared at her, unable to comprehend the depth of her denial. I just nodded slowly and stroked her hand, telling her to save her strength and stop talking. My chest tightened with a familiar, suffocating resentment. It was the same resentment I had swallowed every day since childhood. Jamal was the golden child. He was the firstborn son, the prince of the family who could do absolutely no wrong. Growing up in our small house in the suburbs, Jamal always got the biggest piece of chicken at dinner. He got the brand new sneakers while I wore secondhand shoes from the thrift store. When he crashed her car in high school, she blamed the wet roads and took on an extra shift at the diner to pay for the repairs. When I got a full academic scholarship to college, she barely had time to attend my graduation because she was too busy helping Jamal pay off his massive credit card debt. He was always full of grand schemes and hollow promises. He dressed in designer suits he could not afford and drove cars he leased with her money. He was a master of illusions. And my mother was his most devoted audience. She bought into every single one of his lies without question. She sacrificed her own retirement savings to fund his so-called startup company, which was nothing more than a scam to fund his lavish lifestyle. And then there was Brittany. Jamal met Brittany 3 years ago at a high-end real estate seminar he snuck into. She was a white woman from a wealthy neighborhood who loved the image of a successful minority businessman. She loved his tailored suits and his expensive watches. But she despised where he came from. She despised us. Brittany never missed an opportunity to throw subtle insults at our family. She would refuse to eat the food my mother cooked, claiming she had a delicate stomach. She would wipe down the chairs in my mother's house before sitting down. She treated Evelyn not like a mother-in-law, but like the hired help. She would make passive-aggressive comments about the neighborhood where my mother lived, calling it sketchy and dangerous. Yet Jamal worshipped the ground she walked on, because having a wife like Brittany was the ultimate status symbol for his fake empire. He allowed her to disrespect the very woman who broke her back to give him everything. He stood by and smiled while Brittany insulted the roof over his mother's head. And my mother just took it. She took the insults and the financial abuse because she was terrified of losing her son. She was terrified he would stop calling and stop visiting. So she let him bleed her dry emotionally and financially. But I refused to let him destroy her completely. As a forensic accountant, I spent my days tracking hidden assets and exposing corporate thieves. My brain is wired to find discrepancies and follow the paper trail. It took me less than a week to audit my mother's finances and uncover the massive mess Jamal had made. He was secretly convincing her to sign over the deed to her house so he could secure a massive business loan to pay off his own gambling debts and buy Brittany more designer bags. That was when I stepped in. I used my own money and my legal connections to establish an irrevocable trust. I quietly moved the house and her remaining assets into the trust, making myself the sole trustee. Jamal thought he was playing a long game, but he had no idea he was playing on a board I already owned. The ambulance hit a massive pothole, jarring me back to the present moment. The paramedic called out my mother's dropping blood pressure. The siren seemed to scream louder as the driver accelerated, taking sharp turns through the slick city streets. I looked at the green lines spiking and dipping erratically on the heart monitor. My mother closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid motions. She was fading. She was fighting for her life in the back of a freezing ambulance while her golden boy was sipping overpriced champagne in a club complaining about leather car seats. A dark, heavy silence settled over my heart. I realized then that family is not just about blood. Blood can be a weapon used to manipulate and drain you. True family protects you. Jamal was not family. He was a parasite feeding off the woman who gave him life. And tonight, he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I sat perfectly still in the swaying ambulance, listening to the rain battering the roof. My grief was slowly morphing into something cold and sharp. I would let the doctors save her life tonight. But tomorrow, I was going to dismantle my brother's life piece by piece, until there was absolutely nothing left. The waiting room of the intensive care unit was a desolate place. The walls were painted a sickening pale yellow, and the fluorescent lights hummed above with a constant headache-inducing buzz. I sat on a stiff vinyl chair, staring at the heavy double doors that led to my mother's room. The storm was still raging outside, violently rattling the thin window panes and casting distorted, watery shadows across the floor. It had been 2 grueling hours since the ambulance arrived. 2 hours of agonizing silence and suffocating fear. Then the elevator doors at the far end of the hallway chimed open. Sharp footsteps echoed against the scuffed linoleum floor. They were not the hurried, soft steps of medical staff or the hesitant shuffles of grieving families. They were the sharp, heavy clicks of expensive leather and designer heels. I looked up and watched them walk toward me. Jamal and Brittany looked like they had just stepped off a red carpet event. Jamal was wearing a tailored dark velvet tuxedo jacket that probably cost more than my mother's entire monthly mortgage payment. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Brittany was draped in a floor-length emerald silk gown that clung tightly to her spray-tanned skin. She wore thick diamond earrings that caught the harsh fluorescent light. They were a glaring, offensive contrast to the grim, heartbreaking reality of a public hospital waiting room. Brittany immediately pinched her nose as she approached. She did not even look at me or ask how my mother was doing before she started complaining. She loudly declared that the smell of cheap bleach and sickness was making her physically nauseous. She reached into her glittering clutch and pulled out a small crystal bottle of organic hand sanitizer. She squirted a generous amount onto her palms and rubbed her hands together aggressively, as if simply breathing the unfiltered air in this hospital was contaminating her upper-class existence. She looked at the rows of plastic waiting room chairs with pure unadulterated disgust and outright refused to sit down. She leaned against the wall, carefully making sure her expensive silk dress did not touch the dirty baseboards. She whispered to Jamal, but her voice was intentionally loud enough for me to hear every word. She asked why they had to bring Evelyn to this run-down, overcrowded county hospital instead of the private luxury facility across town. She muttered terrible things about the type of people who end up in places like this side, eyeing a crying family in the corner. She was standing in a hospital where my mother was fighting for her life, and all she cared about was the aesthetic and her own comfort. Jamal did not correct her at all. He did not defend the hospital that had saved his mother's life multiple times in the past when she worked 3 jobs. Instead, he shot his expensive cuffs and looked down at his heavy gold watch. He let out a loud, dramatic sigh of pure annoyance. He finally turned his attention to me. His eyes were cold and completely devoid of any genuine concern or warmth. He did not ask if our mother was conscious. He did not ask what the paramedics or the doctors had said. His very first question to me was, "How long is this going to take?" I stared at him. I felt my jaw tighten so hard my teeth ached, but I kept my face completely blank. I calmly told him she was in emergency surgery and that it could be hours before we knew anything. Jamal rubbed his temples as if he was the one enduring a massive personal tragedy. He paced back and forth in his velvet jacket, tapping his phone against his chin. He started complaining endlessly about the wealthy investors he had left waiting at the VIP club. He said they were on the verge of closing a massive $1 million real estate deal, and that his sudden absence was making him look highly unprofessional to his business partners. He actually had the absolute audacity to say that our mother always picked the worst possible times to have her dramatic medical emergencies. Brittany chimed in immediately, nodding her head in vigorous agreement. She reminded him that they had reservations at an exclusive restaurant after the club, and that they were going to lose their massive non-refundable deposit if this dragged on much longer. They spoke about my mother's potential death as if it were just a mild inconvenience to their busy social calendar. I sat there perfectly still listening to them whine and complain. My forensic analytical mind recorded every single word and every single selfish gesture. I cataloged their unbelievable selfishness, filing it away for the complete destruction I was meticulously planning for tomorrow. Suddenly, the heavy double doors swung open. A doctor in dark green scrubs walked out into the waiting area. He looked completely exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. He pulled off his surgical cap and walked directly over to us. He quietly asked who the family members were for Evelyn. Jamal immediately stepped right in front of me, puffing out his chest to look important. He loudly introduced himself as the eldest son and the official head of the family. The doctor sighed heavily and began to carefully explain the grim situation. He said Evelyn had suffered a massive complicated cardiac event. They had managed to stabilize her for now, but she was unconscious and currently relying on a ventilator to breathe. He warned us that the next 24 hours were absolutely critical and that her heart muscle was extremely weak and failing. He started to explain the potential long-term treatment options and the severe surgical risks involved. Jamal held up his hand abruptly and cut the doctor off mid-sentence. He put on a deeply exaggerated fake mask of sorrow. He lowered his voice, trying desperately to sound like a grieving but highly practical son. He told the doctor that his poor mother had suffered enough over the years. He said she was old and tired, and that keeping her hooked up to machines was simply cruel and unnatural. He looked the doctor right in the eye with a straight face and said, "We do not want to prolong her agony any further." Jamal aggressively demanded that the doctor bring him the do not resuscitate forms immediately. He said he wanted to sign the DNR paperwork right now so they could just let her go peacefully tonight. Brittany stood right behind him, nodding sadly while secretly checking her phone screen for text messages. I knew exactly what Jamal was doing. He was not acting out of compassion or love. He was acting out of pure selfish convenience. Signing a DNR meant he would not have to visit her in a long-term care facility. It meant he would not have to pay any expensive medical bills. It meant he could inherit what he mistakenly thought was his guaranteed share of the estate much faster. Most importantly, it meant he and Brittany could leave this depressing, dirty hospital right now and make it to their dinner reservations on time. He was fully willing to pull the plug on the desperate woman who gave him life just to free up his Friday night schedule. The doctor looked at Jamal with a completely unreadable professional expression. He clutched a medical clipboard tightly against his chest. Jamal snapped his fingers impatiently in the air and told the doctor to hurry up and print the damn forms because he was a very busy man with an important business to run. The sheer arrogance in his voice echoed down the quiet, lonely hospital corridor. I remained seated on the uncomfortable vinyl chair, observing the entire scene. I did not scream or cry or lunge at him. I just watched my brother try to casually sign away our mother's life. I took a slow, deep breath, preparing to drop the first legal bomb of the night. I stood up from the stiff vinyl chair and walked slowly toward the center of the hallway, where Jamal was aggressively tapping his expensive pen against the doctor's clipboard. My footsteps were quiet but completely deliberate. I did not raise my voice when I spoke, but the absolute authority in my tone made the exhausted doctor pause immediately. I looked directly at the doctor and told him not to let Jamal sign a single piece of paper regarding Evelyn. Jamal spun around and glared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. He let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed terribly down the quiet corridor. He asked me who I thought I was to step up and give orders in a life-or-death situation. He stepped much closer to me, using his physical height to try and intimidate me the way he had done since we were children. He turned back to the doctor and told him to ignore his hysterical little sister. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest and told me to go sit back down in the dark corner where I belonged. He sneered and said I was just a glorified calculator, a pathetic forensic accountant who spent her entire life buried in meaningless corporate spreadsheets while he was out in the real world making million-dollar deals and running an actual empire. Brittany laughed out loud from her spot against the hospital wall, casually adjusting her emerald silk gown. She loudly whispered that I was probably just extremely jealous of their massive success and acting out for attention because I had no real life of my own. Jamal nodded vigorously and told the doctor that I was emotionally unstable and completely unfit to make any medical decisions for our aging mother. The doctor looked back and forth between us, clearly uncomfortable with the rapidly escalating family drama playing out in his unit. He held the medical clipboard tightly against his chest and said he needed the legally designated next of kin to make the final call on the life support measures. Jamal puffed out his chest again and proudly declared that as the eldest son, he was the official head of the family and the default next of kin under the law. He reached out his hand, demanding the clipboard one more time so he could sign the "Do Not Resuscitate" order and get to his expensive dinner reservation before they lost their table. I did not flinch or back away from his outstretched hand. I simply reached into my large leather tote bag and pulled out a thick blue folder. It was the exact same folder I had carried with me everywhere since I audited my mother's ruined finances 6 months ago. I calmly walked right past Jamal and handed the heavy folder directly to the chief doctor. Jamal rolled his eyes dramatically and asked if I was trying to show the doctor my pathetic tax returns to prove I could pay the hospital bill. I ignored him entirely and softly told the doctor to turn to the third page of the document stack. The doctor opened the blue folder, and his tired eyes quickly scanned the crisp legal documents inside. The profound annoyance on his face was instantly replaced by a look of complete understanding and massive professional relief. He closed the folder firmly and took a large step back from Jamal. The doctor cleared his throat and looked Jamal right in the eye with a newfound sternness. He firmly stated that he could not allow Jamal to sign the DNR or any other medical forms tonight or ever. Jamal looked completely baffled and angrily demanded to know why a doctor was refusing the orders of the eldest son. The doctor held up the blue folder and announced clearly that Evelyn had legally executed a comprehensive power of attorney over 6 months ago. He read the specific legal clauses aloud, confirming that Maya was designated as the sole medical proxy and the exclusive financial agent for Evelyn in the event of any physical or mental incapacitation. The smug color completely drained from Jamal's face in an instant. His jaw actually dropped open as the harsh reality of the doctor's words slowly registered in his deeply arrogant brain. Brittany stopped checking her phone screen and stood up totally straight, her eyes completely wide with shock and sudden panic. Jamal lunged forward aggressively, trying to snatch the blue folder out of the doctor's hands. He screamed that the paperwork had to be a total fake and that our mother would never give a useless spinster like me absolute control over her medical life and estate. The doctor easily sidestepped his violent grab and pulled the folder safely out of reach. I stood perfectly still and watched my golden child brother completely unravel right in front of me. I told him calmly that the documents were fully notarized, stamped, and registered with the state legal system. I reminded him that while he was busy stealing her retirement money to fund his fake business ventures, I was actually taking real care of her, making sure her future was legally protected from predators just like him. The absolute realization that he had zero legal power in this hospital hit him like a massive physical blow to the stomach. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of crimson, and the thick veins in his neck bulged violently against his expensive velvet tuxedo collar. He started screaming at the very top of his lungs, his voice echoing through the entire intensive care unit. He called me every horrible, degrading name he could possibly think of and violently threatened to sue me and the hospital for everything we were worth. He shouted that he was the golden child, the only offspring our mother actually loved, and that I was just a jealous thief. His unhinged screaming caused two nearby ICU nurses to rush out of their stations in total alarm. The doctor did not hesitate for a single second to take control of the dangerous situation. He picked up the wall phone and called hospital security, reporting a highly hostile and aggressive visitor in the ICU waiting area who was threatening the staff. Jamal was completely losing his mind, pacing frantically back and forth, and viciously kicking a plastic waiting room chair all the way across the room. Brittany grabbed his arm, frantically begging him in a panicked whisper to stop making a scene, because normal people were starting to stare at them, and it looked terrible. Within seconds, 4 large security guards in dark blue uniforms stepped off the main elevator and marched straight toward our completely chaotic scene. The doctor pointed directly at Jamal and Brittany and sternly ordered the security guards to remove them from the hospital premises immediately and permanently. Jamal tried to physically fight back, shouting wildly about his massive wealth and his highly important corporate investors who would ruin this hospital. One of the massive guards grabbed him firmly by the arm of his velvet jacket and forcibly twisted him around, facing the exit. Brittany shrieked loudly as another guard escorted her firmly toward the elevator, warning her that she would be instantly arrested for trespassing if they did not leave peacefully right now. Jamal fought against the strong guards the entire way down the long hall, kicking his shiny shoes and screaming that he was absolutely not done with me yet. I stood quietly next to the doctor and watched the metal elevator doors finally slide shut, completely cutting off his pathetic, raging tantrums. The deep silence that suddenly fell over the hospital waiting room was absolutely beautiful and profoundly peaceful. The doctor handed me back my blue folder with a highly respectful nod and asked if I was finally ready to discuss my mother's real comprehensive treatment plan. I held the power of attorney tightly against my chest, feeling the heavy, incredible weight of the legal shield I had built to protect her from her own son. I looked directly at the doctor and told him to do absolutely everything in his medical power to save her life tonight. I left the sterile, bright lights of the hospital behind and stepped out into the suffocatingly humid night air. The violent thunderstorm had finally passed, leaving the city streets slick and shimmering under the orange glow of the street lamps. I got into a rideshare car and gave the driver the address of my mother's house. As the city skyline faded in the rearview mirror, my mind went to work mapping out Jamal's next inevitable move. He was completely blocked from making medical decisions. His plan to quickly sign away her life and claim an instant inheritance was ruined. But I knew my brother better than he knew himself. He had promised his wealthy investors a massive cash injection by Monday morning. Brittany was already throwing a tantrum about their ruined dinner reservations, and the fragile facade of his fake millionaire lifestyle was crumbling by the second. Desperate men do desperate things, and Jamal was the most desperate man I knew. His next logical target was the only tangible asset he thought he could still control: the legacy property. My mother lived in a sturdy brick house in a historic neighborhood that had been home to Black working-class families for generations. But over the last 5 years, the area had become a major target for aggressive gentrification. The old soul food restaurants and neighborhood barbershops were being bulldozed to make way for overpriced artisan coffee shops and luxury yoga studios. Property values had absolutely skyrocketed. Developers knocked on my mother's door every single week, offering her lowball cash deals, hoping to trick an older woman out of her gold mine. Jamal had been begging her to sell it for years, calling the neighborhood a ghetto and telling her she needed to move into a modern condo. He did not care about the history or the memories. He only saw dollar signs. The rideshare pulled up to the curb, and I stepped out onto the familiar cracked sidewalk. The house stood quietly in the dark, a stark contrast to the modern geometric monstrosities being built on either side of it. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside the pitch-black hallway. The familiar scent of lemon pledge and lingering cinnamon immediately wrapped around me. It smelled exactly like my childhood. I turned on a small amber lamp in the corner of the living room, letting the soft light reveal the sanctuary my mother had built with her blood, sweat, and tears. Every single object in this house told a story of our ancestors' survival and resilience. Draped over the back of the worn velvet sofa was a heavy patchwork quilt that my great-grandmother had sewn by hand using scraps of old dresses and work shirts. Jamal had once tried to throw it in the trash, calling it a dusty rag that ruined the aesthetic of the room. On the mantel above the brick fireplace sat a collection of faded sepia photographs in mismatched silver frames showing generations of proud, strong Black men and women who had endured unimaginable hardships so we could have a better life. Jamal always refused to look at them, saying we needed to focus on the future and stop dwelling on depressing history. In the dining room sat a massive solid mahogany table that my grandfather had bought with his very first bonus check from the steel mill. It was scratched and dented from decades of family dinners, holiday feasts, and late-night homework sessions. Brittany refused to eat at it, complaining that the wood looked cheap and outdated compared to the sleek glass tables in her modern penthouse. They hated this house and everything it stood for. They viewed our family history as a heavy, embarrassing shackle that they needed to break free from in order to impress their rich white friends. But to me, this house was a fortress, and tonight it was going to become a trap. I walked into the small, cramped study at the back of the house. This was where my mother kept her heavy iron safe, hidden behind an old wooden filing cabinet. I knew Jamal would come straight here. I opened my large leather tote bag and pulled out 4 small, high-definition wireless security cameras. I had bought them months ago when I first began auditing her finances, suspecting that Jamal might eventually try to sneak in and steal her physical banking documents. As a forensic accountant, I am meticulously trained to anticipate fraud before it even happens. You do not just follow the money, you anticipate the thief's exact movements. I carefully positioned the first camera on the top shelf of the bookcase, hiding it perfectly between a stack of old leather-bound encyclopedias and a decorative ceramic bowl. I angled the tiny lens so it had a clear, unobstructed view of the iron safe. I placed the second camera in the main hallway, discreetly tucked behind a large potted fern. The third camera went into the living room, positioned to capture the front door and the entire seating area. I synced all the hidden cameras to the secure application on my phone. The live video feeds popped up on my screen instantly in crisp, clear night vision. I could see every single corner of the house illuminated in a ghostly green light. I walked through the rooms, testing the angles and making sure my own face was clearly captured on the recording to establish a timeline. I was creating an airtight digital perimeter. I walked back into the living room and sat down on the velvet sofa, pulling my great-grandmother's patchwork quilt over my lap to ward off the sudden chill in the air. The house was completely silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. The exhaustion of the night was threatening to pull my eyelids down, but my mind was racing with cold, calculating energy. I checked the battery levels on my phone and set it on the mahogany coffee table right in front of me. I did not turn on any other lights. I sat in the dark, breathing in the scent of cinnamon and old wood, waiting for the inevitable. I knew Jamal would not wait until morning. His back was against the wall, and his ego was bruised from being humiliated at the hospital. He needed to prove to Brittany that he was still the man in charge. He needed cash to save his pathetic sinking ship. I looked at the green video feeds glowing softly on my phone screen. I was ready for him. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway slowly chimed midnight. The severe thunderstorm had finally faded into a cold, persistent drizzle that tapped lightly against the living room window panes. I sat completely motionless on the velvet sofa, with the heavy patchwork quilt pulled over my knees. The only light in the entire house came from the soft green glow of my phone screen resting on the mahogany coffee table. My eyes were locked on the 4 camera feeds. I did not have to wait much longer. At exactly 12:15, I heard the distinct squeal of the rusty hinges on the backyard gate. Someone was coming through the narrow alleyway that ran behind the property. I held my breath and watched the camera feed directed at the back kitchen door. A dark silhouette appeared against the frosted glass. There was a metallic scraping sound, followed by a sharp click. Jamal still had his old silver spare key on his keychain. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, trying to be stealthy, but his expensive leather shoes thudded loudly against the worn linoleum floor. Brittany followed closely behind him, clutching a small silver flashlight. On my phone screen, their faces were illuminated in the eerie green night vision, making them look like the greedy ghosts they truly were. I sat merely 30 feet away in the pitch-black living room, listening to their hushed voices echo down the narrow hallway. Brittany immediately started complaining, her voice dripping with extreme disgust. She aggressively wiped her designer shoes on the kitchen mat, whispering loudly that the disgusting mud in this ghetto was going to ruin her expensive suede heels. She told Jamal to hurry up because she was terrified someone in this terrible hood was going to strip their luxury car for parts while they were inside. She called my mother's beloved home a decrepit shack and said she felt like she was going to catch an infectious disease just by breathing the stagnant air. Jamal harshly shushed her, telling her to keep her voice down and shine the flashlight straight ahead. They bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight down the corridor toward the cramped back study. I watched on the camera feed as they entered the small room. Jamal walked directly over to the old wooden filing cabinet in the corner. He grabbed the heavy oak sides and grunted as he shoved it across the floor, revealing the small iron safe hidden in the wall behind it. Brittany stood in the doorway, crossing her arms and shivering in her damp evening gown. She told him again to hurry up and get the stupid papers so they could leave this depressing neighborhood. Jamal dropped to his knees in front of the heavy iron door. He did not need any tools to break in. He reached out and confidently spun the metal dial. He knew the combination perfectly. It was the exact date our father had passed away. A date my mother held sacred, and a date Jamal was now using to rob her blind. The heavy internal tumblers clicked heavily into place, and the thick metal door swung open with a soft metallic groan. Jamal aggressively reached his hands inside, pulling out stacks of old tax returns and fading family birth certificates, throwing them carelessly onto the dusty floor. Then he found it. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope bound with a red string. He eagerly unwound the string and slid out the crisp white documents. The beam of Brittany's flashlight hit the top page, illuminating the bold black letters that read, "Property Deed." Jamal let out a low, victorious chuckle. He held the deed up in the air like a magnificent stolen trophy. He bragged to Brittany that this single piece of paper was their golden ticket out of the financial mess he had created. He told her he already had a shady private lender lined up who was willing to give him a massive $300,000 cash advance, using the house as total collateral. Brittany leaned in closer, her eyes wide with sudden, insatiable greed. She told him to look deeper inside the safe to see what else the old woman was hiding from them. Jamal reached his arm all the way to the back of the cold iron box and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. He flipped it open and scanned the first page. A wide, greedy smile spread across his face. He held it up to the flashlight and told Brittany it was a comprehensive life insurance policy. He read the numbers aloud, confirming a massive $500,000 death benefit payable upon Evelyn's passing. Brittany let out a sharp gasp of pure delight. She completely forgot about her previous disgust for the house. She reached out and traced her manicured fingers over the life insurance documents, telling Jamal that between the house loan and the insurance payout, they were going to be set for a very long time. She actually laughed a cruel, empty sound and said it was a good thing his mother was currently on life support because her timing was finally working out in their absolute favor. My blood ran completely cold as I listened to her evil words. I sat in the shadows of the living room, gripping the edge of the velvet sofa so tightly my knuckles ached. They were standing in my mother's house, casually celebrating her impending death and actively plotting to steal everything she had worked her entire life to build. The microphone on the hidden camera captured every single horrible word they said with crystal clear precision. This was no longer just a terrible family dispute over inheritance. This was a documented felony burglary and a premeditated financial crime. I watched as Jamal quickly shoved both the property deed and the life insurance policy into the inside pocket of his damp velvet tuxedo jacket. He kicked the iron safe door shut with his heavy shoe, not even bothering to spin the dial to lock it back up. He left the old tax returns and our family birth certificates scattered all over the dirty floor like absolute garbage. He grabbed Brittany's arm, and they hurried back down the hallway toward the kitchen. I held my breath and pressed myself deep into the dark cushions of the sofa as they passed by the living room entrance. They did not even look in my direction. They were too consumed by their own greedy victory to notice the silent auditor sitting just feet away in the shadows. I heard the kitchen door open and close, followed by the sharp click of the lock. The squeaky back gate whined once more, and then the property fell completely silent again. They were gone. I looked down at my phone screen. The high-definition video file had automatically saved to my secure cloud server. I had the definitive proof I needed. They thought they had just secured a massive fortune. But I knew the devastating truth. They had just stolen utterly worthless pieces of paper. The real deed, the one that legally transferred the property into the irrevocable trust, was safely locked inside a bank vault downtown under my exclusive name. Jamal was about to walk into a commercial bank and try to secure a massive loan using stolen, outdated, and legally void documents. He had just handed me the rope to hang him with, and he did not even realize it. I slowly stood up from the couch and walked into the study to look at the heartbreaking mess he had left behind. The trap was officially set. The small study smelled like disturbed dust and old paper. I stood over the heavy iron safe staring at the family history my brother had casually thrown onto the floor. Birth certificates, tax returns, and my grandfather's honorable discharge papers were scattered like meaningless trash. My mother had kept these documents safe for decades, and Jamal had violated that sanctuary in less than 5 minutes. Any normal person would have dialed 911 right then and there to report a break-in. They would have shown the police the security footage and Jamal would have been arrested for simple burglary. But simple burglary would only get him a slap on the wrist. He would post bail, hire a flashy defense attorney, and spin a lie about having permission to enter his mother's house. I was not going to let him charm his way out of this one. I wanted him completely ruined. I wanted a federal indictment. I turned away from the mess and walked back to the living room to retrieve my laptop from my heavy leather tote bag. I sat down at the mahogany dining table, the very table Brittany despised, and opened my computer. The screen illuminated the dark room with a harsh bluish-white light. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a brief second before I started typing. As a forensic accountant investigating corporate fraud, I spent my entire career tracking digital footprints left by arrogant men who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Jamal was incredibly arrogant and entirely careless. He used the same predictable passwords for everything, and he had a habit of connecting his devices to any open Wi-Fi network he could find. It took me less than 10 minutes to access his primary email account and mirror his current web browsing session. I watched the data load on my screen, revealing exactly what he was doing in real time. He and Brittany were sitting in their luxury SUV, probably parked down the street connecting to a public hotspot to send the stolen documents. My eyes quickly scanned the sent folder of his email. There it was. An email sent to a predatory private lending firm known for dealing in high-risk, fast-cash real estate loans. The subject line read, "Urgent collateral documents attached for immediate funding." I opened the email and read through the terms Jamal was eagerly agreeing to. He was applying for a $300,000 bridge loan. The interest rate was absolutely extortionate, a clear sign of his total financial desperation. He had scanned the stolen property deed and the life insurance policy right from his phone and attached them as proof of collateral. He even forged my mother's signature on the digital promissory note, claiming she was a co-signer who had granted him full authorization to borrow against her estate. My heart pounded a slow, steady rhythm of pure, calculating anger as I analyzed the financial trap he was building for himself. In the United States, using the internet to transmit forged documents across state lines to secure a loan is not a minor local crime. It is the textbook definition of federal wire fraud and bank fraud. Each count carries a potential penalty of decades in federal prison. Jamal was not just stealing a piece of paper anymore. He was actively committing a major federal offense right before my eyes. He requested the funds to be wired directly into his failing business account by Monday morning. I leaned back in the wooden dining chair and let out a long, slow breath. If I stopped him right now, the crime would only be attempted fraud. I needed him to actually receive the money. I needed the fraudulent wire transfer to clear the banking system, because once those stolen funds hit his account, the federal crime was fully executed and utterly irreversible. I picked up my phone and checked the time. It was 2 in the morning, but I knew my private attorney was a night owl who billed by the hour. I dialed Harrison's direct line. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy but alert. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told Harrison that my brother had just broken into the house and stolen the outdated property deed. I told him Jamal was currently using that voided deed to secure a massive fraudulent loan. Harrison was instantly wide awake. He asked if I wanted him to contact the local authorities to intercept the loan application. I told him absolutely not. I instructed my lawyer to contact the trust department at our bank first thing in the morning and prepare the legal affidavits proving the home was safely secured in the irrevocable trust long before tonight. I told Harrison we were going to let the predatory lender approve the loan and wire the $300,000 into Jamal's account. Harrison let out a low whistle over the phone, warning me that playing this kind of high-stakes game with federal fraud was incredibly dangerous. I told him I knew exactly what I was doing. I was a certified fraud examiner, and I had the entire crime documented on high-definition video, audio, and mirrored data logs. I told Harrison to draft a comprehensive report for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and have it ready to file the absolute second that wire transfer cleared on Monday. Harrison agreed to prepare the federal trap and hung up the phone, leaving me alone in the quiet house again. I looked back at my computer screen, watching Jamal's digital activity. He was logging into his online banking portal, frantically refreshing the page, waiting to see if the pending loan approval had updated. His absolute greed was blinding him to the massive legal snare tightening around his neck. He thought he was a brilliant businessman pulling off the ultimate save. He had no idea he was just a desperate rat walking straight into a steel trap built by the sister he had constantly belittled. I closed my laptop and packed it away in my bag. The green lights of my hidden cameras blinked softly in the shadows, standing guard over the empty safe. Tomorrow my mother would be discharged from the hospital, and Jamal would undoubtedly try to put on a grand show of being the dutiful, loving son. He would smile in her face while secretly waiting for that stolen money to hit his account. And I would be standing right there watching him dig his own grave deeper and deeper with every lie he told. I walked out the front door and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me, ready to face the absolute chaos that tomorrow would bring. The morning sun felt unusually harsh as I pushed my mother's wheelchair through the sliding automatic doors of the hospital. Evelyn looked incredibly fragile, wrapped in a thin fleece blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. The doctors had warned us that her recovery would be a long and difficult process requiring absolute peace and quiet. But peace and quiet were the absolute last things on Jamal's agenda. He and Brittany had arrived at the hospital exactly 10 minutes before discharge, dressed in perfectly coordinated casual weekend wear. Jamal practically shoved me out of the way to take control of the wheelchair handles, flashing a brilliant fake smile for the nurses. He loudly thanked the medical staff for taking such good care of his precious mother, acting as though he had been pacing the waiting room all night instead of committing federal wire fraud. I walked silently behind them, carrying her small overnight bag, watching the performance begin. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the quiet sanctuary of my mother's backyard had been completely transformed into a loud, chaotic spectacle. Jamal had decided to throw a massive family cookout. He claimed it was to celebrate Evelyn's miraculous recovery, but I knew the real reason. It was a victory party. He was high on the adrenaline of his successful heist and the pending $300,000 wire transfer. He wanted to stand in the yard he thought he now financially controlled and play the role of the generous, wealthy patriarch. He had hired a local catering crew to set up a massive industrial smoker in the corner of the yard. The air was thick with the heavy smell of hickory wood roasting ribs and expensive brisket. Folding tables were covered in bright checkered cloths and loaded with side dishes. The entire extended family had been invited, and they showed up in droves. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and second cousins filled the small backyard, their loud laughter and overlapping conversations drowning out the soft jazz playing from the outdoor speakers. Jamal was in his absolute element. He walked through the crowd holding a premium imported beer, shaking hands and slapping backs. He wore a crisp white linen shirt and designer sunglasses, looking every bit the successful entrepreneur he desperately pretended to be. He told anyone who would listen that he had personally covered all the medical bills and was stepping up to take full financial responsibility for the family estate. The relatives ate it up completely. They looked at him with pure admiration, completely blinded by the expensive meat he had bought and the charming smile he wore. I sat in a rusted metal lawn chair near the back porch, keeping a very close eye on my mother. Evelyn was parked in her wheelchair under the shade of a large oak tree. She looked exhausted, the noise and the heat clearly draining the little energy she had left. But she forced a weak smile every time a relative came up to squeeze her hand. Aunt Martha, the loudest and most judgmental of my mother's sisters, marched over to me holding a plate piled high with potato salad and ribs. She wore a brightly colored sundress and a large woven hat, looking down at me with an expression of deep disappointment. She pointed a plastic fork at my chest and told me I needed to take a long, hard look at my brother and learn what real success looked like. She loudly declared that Jamal was a true blessing to this family, a strong black man who was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. She looked at my plain jeans and simple cotton shirt and clicked her tongue in disapproval. She asked me why I was just sitting there in the corner instead of helping Brittany pass out the drinks. She said it was an absolute shame that with all my supposed education, I was still just a glorified secretary pushing papers while my brother was out here building a real empire and taking care of our sick mother. I looked past Aunt Martha's pointing fork and watched Brittany. My wealthy white sister-in-law was standing near the patio, wearing a flowing designer dress, holding a red plastic cup with just the tips of her fingers, as if it were contaminated. She was smiling tightly at my teenage cousins, but I could see the absolute disgust in her eyes. She hated being in this neighborhood. She hated the loud music and the crowded yard. But she was playing her part beautifully, whispering in the ears of the older relatives about how hard Jamal worked and how stressed he was trying to hold the family together. Aunt Martha leaned in closer, her heavy perfume mixing unpleasantly with the smell of the barbecue smoke. She lowered her voice but made sure the surrounding relatives could still hear every word. She told me I should be endlessly grateful to have a brother like Jamal. She said if it were not for him, our mother would be rotting in some terrible state-run facility because a simple accountant like me could never afford to give her the care she deserved. Several of my older cousins nodded in agreement, chiming in to say how blessed Evelyn was to have a son who stepped up to the plate. The absolute hypocrisy of the entire scene was suffocating. They were standing in the very yard Jamal had just fraudulently mortgaged to a predatory lender. They were eating food bought with the same credit cards that were about to be permanently frozen. They were praising a man who had stood in a hospital waiting room just 12 hours earlier, aggressively demanding a do not resuscitate order so he could go to a fancy dinner. I did not defend myself. I did not snap back at Aunt Martha or tell my cousins they were praising a federal criminal. My forensic accounting background had taught me that arguing with fools was a complete waste of breath. You do not win by raising your voice. You win by letting the math do the talking. I simply looked up at Aunt Martha, took a slow sip of my ice water, and told her she was absolutely right. I said Jamal was definitely about to get exactly what he deserved. She smiled smugly completely, misunderstanding my meaning, and patted me condescendingly on the shoulder before waddling away to get more brisket. I turned my attention back to Jamal. He was standing near the smoker, laughing loudly at a joke one of the uncles had made. He caught my eye from across the yard. His smile widened into a malicious, arrogant smirk. He raised his imported beer bottle in the air and tipped it toward me in a silent, mocking toast. He thought he had won. He thought he had stolen the deed secured. The loan impressed the family and completely defeated his annoying little sister. I held his gaze and offered a tiny, chilling smile in return. Let him eat his expensive brisket. Let him soak in the misplaced adoration of the aunties. Let him play the generous patriarch for one more day. Because tomorrow was Monday. The banks would open, the wire transfer would clear, and the absolute destruction of his entire fake life would officially begin. The sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, heavy shadows across the crowded yard. The loud music continued to pulse from the outdoor speakers, but the real entertainment was just about to begin. I watched Brittany march out of the back door of my mother's house carrying a large black plastic trash bag. She dragged it down the wooden patio steps, her designer heels clicking sharply against the wood. She walked right into the center of the lawn, intentionally drawing the attention of every single family member who was standing nearby, holding a plate of barbecue. She did not gently place the bag on the grass. She lifted it up and violently shook the contents out right in front of my mother's wheelchair. My breath caught in my throat as I saw exactly what fell into the dirt. It was my mother's hand-knitted sweaters, her old photo albums, and the delicate porcelain figurines she had collected ever since I was a little girl. The fragile porcelain shattered against a stray rock in the grass, sending sharp white fragments flying across the dirt. A collective gasp rippled through the aunties and uncles who were standing near the food tables. I looked down at Evelyn. Her frail hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly that her knuckles turned completely white. She did not say a single word. She did not cry out or demand an explanation. She just stared at the broken pieces of her life scattered in the dirt. Her silent endurance spoke volumes about the decades of emotional abuse she had swallowed just to keep the peace in this family. It was absolutely heartbreaking to witness a woman who had sacrificed everything being treated like absolute garbage in her own backyard. Brittany did not even flinch at the destruction she had just caused. She wiped her hands together vigorously, as if she had just touched something highly contaminated. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She reached into her expensive leather clutch and pulled out a thick white envelope. She did not lean down to hand it to me respectfully. She tossed it casually into the air, letting it flutter to the ground and land right on top of a broken porcelain angel. She crossed her thin arms and loudly announced to the silent yard that there was exactly $2,000 in that envelope. She said it was more than generous, considering how much of a massive financial burden we had been on her successful husband. She spoke slowly and loudly, treating me like I was completely stupid and incompetent. She told me to use that cash to pack up the rest of the worthless garbage inside the house and check Evelyn into a state-run nursing facility by the end of the week. She actually used the words cheap and out of the way. The sheer audacity of her voice echoed over the smooth jazz music. She looked around the yard at the silent relatives and proudly declared that she and Jamal were tearing this entire decrepit shack down to the foundation. She said they were going to bulldoze the legacy property and build a modern 3-story mansion with a rooftop deck and a heavy iron gate to keep the neighborhood riffraff out. She sneered at the old beautiful oak tree, providing shade for my mother, and said it would be the very first thing to be chopped down because it dropped disgusting leaves all over her imported luxury car. Aunt Martha, who had just been praising Jamal minutes earlier, suddenly looked incredibly uncomfortable. She opened her mouth as if to say something in defense of the house, but Brittany shot her a lethal, icy glare that silenced the older woman instantly. Brittany turned her attention back to my mother, who was still staring blankly at the ruined photo albums. Brittany leaned down, invading my mother's personal space. She told Evelyn it was time to let go of the past and stop holding her brilliant son back from his true potential. She said this historic house was a toxic dump and that Evelyn should be incredibly grateful they were finally stepping in to clean up her pathetic mess. The rage inside me was a living, breathing entity. It wanted to reach out and grab Brittany by her expensive silk dress and throw her straight into the smoking barbecue pit. But I forced every single muscle in my body to remain completely relaxed. I let my forensic accounting mind take over, calculating the exact amount of rope they were eagerly tying around their own necks. They were openly confessing their premeditated plans to destroy a real estate asset they did not even legally own. They were doing it in broad daylight in front of 30 witnesses. I slowly reached down and picked up the white envelope from the dirt. It felt heavy with crisp new bills. It was stolen money borrowed from a predatory lender based on a forged deed, and Jamal was letting his wife throw it in my face. I opened the flap of the envelope and looked at the stack of $100 bills inside. I looked back up at Brittany, who was smirking triumphantly. She actually thought she had just bought my absolute compliance and my mother's entire legacy for a measly $2,000. I asked her in a perfectly calm, quiet voice if Jamal completely agreed with this demolition plan. Brittany laughed, a sharp, grating sound that cut right through the humid air. She said Jamal was the one who authorized the cash withdrawal. She bragged loudly that her husband was a financial visionary who knew exactly how to maximize real estate assets, and that he was completely done carrying the dead weight of his past. There was that horrible phrase again, dead weight. He had used it on the phone while my mother was having a massive heart attack, and now his cruel wife was using it right to her face. I looked at my mother. A single silent tear slipped down her weathered cheek and dropped onto her fleece blanket. She had sacrificed her retirement and her credit score for the boy who was currently standing by the smoker, pretending not to see his wife destroying his mother's most treasured belongings. Jamal was a complete coward. He let Brittany do his dirty work so he could maintain his fake glowing image of the generous provider in front of the extended family. I looked at the broken porcelain angel in the grass, and then directly into Brittany's cold blue eyes. I did not scream or throw the stolen money back in her face. I simply nodded my head. I told her I understood perfectly. I carefully folded the thick envelope and slid it safely into the front pocket of my jeans. Brittany rolled her eyes and muttered something terrible about how easy it was to buy off poor desperate people. She turned around on her designer heels and strutted back toward the patio, looking incredibly pleased with her cruel performance. Brittany walked away, swaying her hips in her expensive silk dress, leaving a trail of heavy floral perfume that violently clashed with the smell of the roasting hickory wood. I stood there for a long moment, feeling the thick envelope of stolen cash burning a hole against my leg through the fabric of my jeans. I turned my attention away from the shattered porcelain angel lying in the dirt and focused entirely on my brother. Jamal was standing a few yards away near the massive black metal smoker. He was leaning against the brick railing of the patio, holding a fresh bottle of imported beer and laughing obnoxiously at something Uncle George had just said. He looked so incredibly relaxed and confident, entirely convinced that he was the absolute master of his universe. I began to walk slowly across the lawn toward him. My sneakers made soft, crushing sounds against the dry summer grass. The yard was suddenly very quiet. The tension from Brittany's cruel outburst still hung thick and heavy in the humid afternoon air. The relatives parted for me, slightly stepping back to give me a clear path to the golden child. They watched me with wide, curious eyes, probably expecting me to finally break down and scream, or throw a dramatic fit. But I did not feel any urge to scream. I felt a deep, chilling calm wash over my entire body. My mind was operating like a perfectly tuned machine, recording every detail, every witness, and every variable. I stopped right in front of Jamal. His loud laughter immediately died down. He took a slow sip of his beer and looked at me with that familiar arrogant smirk, tilting his chin up to look down his nose at me. He asked me if I was finally ready to pack up my mother's trash and get out of his yard. I did not lose my temper. I did not raise my voice even a fraction of an inch. Instead, I gave him a perfectly calm, icy smile. It was the exact kind of smile I used in the interrogation room when a corrupt corporate executive was about to accidentally hand me the missing piece of a massive fraud puzzle. It was a smile that made smart men extremely nervous. But Jamal was not a smart man. He was a narcissist entirely blinded by his own towering ego. I spoke clearly and deliberately, making sure my voice carried easily over the soft jazz music and the sizzling meat on the grill. I looked him dead in the eyes and asked him, "So you took out a $300,000 mortgage on this house?" A dead silence instantly fell over the immediate area. Aunt Martha paused with her plastic cup halfway to her mouth. Uncle George stopped chewing his brisket. Jamal looked genuinely surprised for a tiny fraction of a second, his brow furrowing as he clearly wondered how in the world I knew the exact dollar amount of his secret late-night transaction. But his massive, fragile ego quickly overrode his brief moment of caution. He looked around at the captive audience of silent relatives staring at him. He could not look weak in front of them. He could not let his little sister intimidate him in front of his wife and his family. He had to own it. He had to look like the ultimate boss. He let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded entirely forced. He took another long sip of his beer and looked down at me like I was a naive, pathetic child who simply did not understand how the real world worked. He loudly declared to the entire yard that yes, he absolutely did take out a $300,000 loan against the property. He puffed out his chest and bragged that it was a brilliant, strategic financial maneuver designed to free up trapped equity in a depreciating neighborhood. He started aggressively throwing around corporate buzzwords, trying desperately to sound like a Wall Street genius to a bunch of working-class relatives. He told everyone that the massive cash injection was going to fund his next major business venture and completely pay for the demolition of this depressing old shack, so he and Brittany could build the mansion they truly deserved. I pushed him just a little bit further, playing the part of the confused and helpless younger sister. I tilted my head and asked him how he possibly managed to secure a loan of that size when the house was supposedly meant for both of us, and our mother was currently incapacitated and completely unable to sign any legal documents. Jamal scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively in the air. He practically shouted that he did not need anyone's permission because he was the eldest son. He claimed it was his absolute divine birthright to take total control of the family assets when the matriarch was no longer fit to manage them. He actually boasted right there in broad daylight about going into the hidden iron safe and securing the property deed himself. He said he took the aggressive initiative that a real man takes to secure his legacy and protect his future. He told the crowd that the bank practically begged him to take the money because his credit and his business acumen were just that incredible. I looked around the quiet yard. 30 pairs of eyes were locked directly on him. 30 witnesses had just heard him openly confess to breaking into a safe, stealing a property deed, and securing a massive fraudulent loan, while our mother was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. He even proudly admitted to the exact dollar amount of the illegal wire transfer. He was so deeply intoxicated by his own perceived power and his desperate, pathetic need to look wealthy in front of his superficial wife and the extended family that he was literally shouting a full verbal confession to federal bank fraud in his own backyard. Jamal took a step closer to me, pointing the wet neck of his beer bottle right at my face. He told me that I needed to learn my place in the hierarchy of this family. He said I was just a bitter, jealous spinster who played with boring spreadsheets all day, while he was out there making the big moves and shaking up the industry. He leaned in, lowering his voice just a fraction, but still loud enough for Aunt Martha to hear. He told me the wire transfer was clearing first thing Monday morning. He said once that cash hit his business account, I would have exactly 48 hours to get our mother out of his sight before his demolition crew arrived to tear the roof down. He smiled, showing all of his perfectly whitened teeth, and told me to take Brittany's generous $2,000 and run before he decided to kick us both out onto the street with absolutely nothing. I let his horrible, arrogant words hang in the heavy, humid air. I did not argue with his logic. I did not cry or beg him to reconsider. And most importantly, I did not present the devastating truth about the irrevocable trust. The trap was now fully sprung, and the rat was locked securely inside, happily eating the poisonous bait with a giant, victorious smile on his face. I just kept that icy smile on my lips, burning his confession into my flawless memory. I turned my back on him. I did not give him the satisfaction of a screaming match or a tearful breakdown. He wanted a dramatic scene to justify his cruel actions to the rest of the family, but I completely refused to play his game. I walked away from the heavy smoke of the barbecue pit, leaving him standing there with his expensive beer and his hollow victory. The thick, humid air felt suddenly lighter as I distanced myself from his massive, toxic ego. I walked straight past Uncle George, who was staring at me with his mouth slightly open, holding a half-eaten plate of food. The entire yard was watching my every move, waiting for the explosive reaction that was never going to come. I reached my mother, who was still sitting quietly under the shade of the old oak tree. She looked up at me, her eyes red and tired from the sheer emotional exhaustion of the afternoon. I knelt down in the dirt right next to the shattered pieces of her favorite porcelain angel. I reached into my pocket and made sure the thick white envelope filled with Brittany's $2,000 was completely secure. That stolen cash was going straight into a secure escrow account to be used as physical evidence of their bribery and fraud. I did not say a word about what Jamal had just confessed. I simply reached out and gently took my mother's trembling hands in mine. I told her softly that it was time to go home. I began to gather the discarded items that Brittany had so violently thrown onto the lawn. I picked up the heavy, hand-knitted sweaters, shaking the dust off the worn wool. I carefully stacked the old family photo albums, making sure none of the loose sepia photographs fluttered away in the slight breeze. Aunt Martha waddled over, wiping her hands nervously on a paper napkin. She looked down at the broken porcelain and then up at me, her face a mixture of pity and deep confusion. She asked me if I was really just going to give up and let my brother tear the family home down. She whispered that maybe if I just apologized and showed a little respect, Jamal might let us stay in the house a bit longer. I stood up holding the stack of photo albums tightly against my chest. I looked at Aunt Martha with a completely blank expression. I told her I did not need to apologize to a man who was building a house of cards on a foundation of lies. I told her to enjoy the expensive brisket because it was the absolute last meal Jamal would ever be able to afford to buy for this family. Aunt Martha frowned deeply, clearly, not understanding the massive legal weight behind my words. She simply shook her head and stepped back, allowing me to pass. I placed the rescued items securely into my large leather tote bag. I stepped behind my mother's wheelchair and unlocked the brakes. I turned the chair around, making sure to steer the wheels carefully over the uneven grass and the scattered debris. We moved slowly through the crowd of silent relatives. Nobody stepped forward to help us. Nobody offered to carry the bag or open the heavy wooden gate at the side of the yard. They just watched us leave, their faces painted with a sickening blend of judgment and relief. They were relieved that the uncomfortable tension was leaving with us, so they could go back to eating their free food and pretending that they belonged to a wealthy, successful family. As I pushed the wheelchair down the side path toward the front driveway, I heard Jamal's booming laugh echo one last time over the outdoor speakers. He was probably already spinning a brand new lie, telling the uncles how he had successfully put his unstable sister in her place. He was celebrating his hostile takeover, completely unaware that he had just signed his own financial death warrant. We reached the curb where my ride-share vehicle was already waiting. The driver, a kind older gentleman, immediately got out and helped me safely transfer my exhausted mother into the comfortable back seat. I folded the wheelchair and placed it in the trunk along with my heavy tote bag. I climbed into the back seat next to Evelyn and the driver pulled away from the curb. I looked out the tinted window, watching the legacy property slowly disappear behind us. The brick house stood tall and proud in the afternoon sun, keeping its quiet secrets safely locked away. My mother leaned her head against my shoulder and let out a long, trembling sigh. She asked me in a whisper what we were going to do now that Jamal had taken the house. I wrapped my arm tightly around her shoulders and kissed the top of her head. I told her she did not need to worry about a single thing. I promised her that the house was perfectly safe and that Jamal was never going to touch a single brick of it. She closed her eyes, too exhausted to question my absolute certainty. The drive across the city was smooth and quiet. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt matched the cold, calculating cadence of my racing thoughts. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window and let my mind fast forward to Monday morning. In exactly 36 hours, the automated banking systems would come back online. The massive servers at the predatory lending firm would process the forged paperwork and authorize the release of $300,000. The digital funds would travel through the federal wire network and land directly into Jamal's failing commercial account. The moment that money officially registered in his ledger, the trap would permanently snap shut. He thought he was riding a massive wave of success. He thought his fake empire was finally secure. But he did not realize that the wave was actually a devastating financial tsunami, and it was currently building momentum in the deep, dark ocean of the federal legal system. When it finally hit the shore, it was not just going to wash away his expensive luxury SUV or his tailored velvet suits. It was going to violently rip the entire foundation of his pathetic, fraudulent life completely out from under him. It was going to drag him and his cruel, superficial wife down into a suffocating abyss of federal indictments, frozen assets, and massive prison sentences. I watched the city skyline pass by my window, feeling a profound sense of peace. I had played my part perfectly. Now all I had to do was wait for the storm to hit. The soft morning light began to filter through the sheer curtains of my high-rise apartment, casting a warm, golden glow across the polished hardwood floors. It was Monday morning. The digital clock on my bedside table silently clicked to exactly 6 a.m. Outside the city was just beginning to wake up, with the faint, distant hum of early commuter traffic echoing up from the streets below. Inside my apartment, the absolute peace was violently shattered by the aggressive, relentless vibrating of my cell phone against the nightstand. It was not ringing because I had deliberately set it to silent the night before, knowing exactly what was coming. But the sheer frequency of the vibrations made it sound like a trapped, angry insect desperately trying to escape. I rolled over slowly, tangling my legs in the high-thread count sheets, and reached for the heavy device. The screen was completely lit up with a massive wall of urgent notifications that spanned across 3 separate pages. My thumb swiped upward, and the precise numbers confirmed exactly what I had been waiting for all weekend. 97 missed calls from Jamal, 40 unread text messages from Brittany. The storm had officially made landfall, and it was tearing their lives apart. I did not feel a single ounce of panic or guilt. I felt the quiet, deeply satisfying thrill of a forensic accountant watching the final numbers perfectly balance out on a cold, hard ledger of justice. I sat up in bed, pulling my silk robe over my shoulders, and leaned back against the headboard to read the digital documentation of their absolute ruin. I opened Brittany's message thread first. It was a brilliant psychological study in the rapid total collapse of a narcissist who was suddenly losing her grip on reality. The very first text had arrived at exactly 5:02 a.m. It read, "Wake up Maya and call Jamal right now. The bank is making some kind of stupid technical error with his business accounts, and the teller is refusing to speak to him on the phone." It was classic Brittany demanding and entirely dismissive of anyone else's time. 10 minutes later, the tone began to shift slightly. "Maya, I am not joking. Answer your phone. Jamal is on hold with the Federal Reserve Branch, and they are telling him his accounts are locked due to fraudulent activity. Fix this right now before he misses his investor meeting." I smiled, tracing my index finger over the cracked glass of my screen. By 5:30 a.m., the fake arrogance had completely evaporated, leaving behind only raw, unadulterated panic. "Maya, please pick up the phone. Jamal's luxury SUV was just towed out of our driveway by a commercial repo company, and all of my platinum credit cards are declining at the grocery store. What did you do to the trust fund? Call the bank and authorize our cards immediately." The messages became more and more frantic with every passing minute. They were riddled with embarrassing typos and desperate, pathetic pleas. The final message, sent just 2 minutes before I woke up, read, "Maya, please, I am begging you. The bank manager is saying the deed Jamal used for the $300,000 loan was invalid, and that the FBI has flagged his incoming wire transfer for federal bank fraud. Please tell them it was a misunderstanding. We are going to lose everything. We have no cash to even buy gas." I locked my phone screen and tossed it carelessly onto the mattress. I did not type back a single word. Let them sweat. Let them pace the imported hardwood floors of their rented penthouse, while their entire fake world burned to absolute ashes around them. I stood up from the bed and walked out of my room, padding softly down the hallway toward the kitchen. The apartment was incredibly quiet, a beautiful sanctuary away from the chaos they had created. I walked over to my expensive espresso machine and began my morning routine with meticulous, unhurried precision. I filled the water reservoir, measuring out the exact grams of freshly roasted coffee beans. The grinder whirred to life, filling the kitchen with a rich, earthy aroma that grounded me completely in the present moment. I took a deep breath, letting the smell of the roasted beans replace the lingering stench of hickory smoke and cheap beer from the backyard cookout. I watched the dark liquid drip slowly into the ceramic mugs, reflecting on the sheer perfection of the federal banking system. When the $300,000 wire transfer hit Jamal's account, the automated fraud detection algorithms at the central bank instantly flagged the massive discrepancy between the stolen, outdated deed and the active, irrevocable trust I had filed months ago. Because the amount exceeded federal thresholds and crossed state financial lines, it automatically triggered a total asset freeze. They did not just freeze the stolen money, they froze every single dollar attached to his social security number, his business accounts, his personal checking, his lines of credit. Even Brittany's joint shopping accounts were instantly locked down by the federal government pending a massive criminal investigation. He was entirely paralyzed, unable to move a single dime. I steamed the milk, listening to the gentle hiss of the wand. I poured it carefully into the espresso, creating a perfect white heart shape on the surface of the dark coffee. I placed both mugs on a small wooden tray along with a fresh pastry I had bought from the local bakery the day before. I picked up the tray and walked slowly toward the guest bedroom, where my mother was sleeping. I pushed the door open gently with my shoulder. Evelyn was already awake, sitting propped up against the fluffy pillows watching the morning news on the small flat-screen television. She looked so much better than she had yesterday. The color was slowly returning to her cheeks, and the heavy weight of Jamal's emotional abuse seemed to have lifted from her fragile shoulders during the quiet night away from his toxic presence. I walked over and placed the wooden tray gently on her lap. She smiled up at me, taking the warm ceramic mug in her frail hands. She took a slow sip, closing her eyes in deep appreciation of the rich coffee. She asked me if I had slept well, her voice sounding stronger than it had in weeks. I sat down on the edge of the mattress holding my own mug and gave her a genuine relaxed smile. I told her I had slept better than I had in years, knowing that we were finally completely safe. My phone buzzed aggressively again in the deep pocket of my silk robe. 98 missed calls. I ignored it completely, taking a long, slow sip of my coffee. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, illuminating the endless city below. It was a truly beautiful day for a federal indictment. The digital clock on the stainless steel microwave shifted to exactly 7 a.m. My mother was happily watching the morning news, sipping her fresh coffee in total peace down the hall. My phone buzzed again for the 100th time, sliding a few inches across the smooth granite countertop. I decided it was finally time to let him speak. I picked up the heavy device and swiped my thumb across the glowing green accept button. I did not say hello. I did not ask what was wrong. I simply lifted the phone to my ear and listened to the absolute destruction of my older brother's massive, arrogant ego. The audio that poured out of the tiny speaker was absolute pure chaos. Jamal was not just yelling, he was actively screaming at the very top of his lungs. His voice cracked with a high-pitched, hysterical edge that I had never heard from him before. In the background, I could hear the loud mechanical grinding of heavy hydraulic lifts and the sharp, piercing beep of a commercial tow truck backing up into a driveway. Brittany was shrieking hysterically in the distance, her voice sounding shrill and completely unhinged. She was screaming at someone, telling them they had no right to touch her luxury property and threatening to call the police on them immediately. "Maya, is that you? Maya, you need to listen to me right now." Jamal screamed into the receiver, his breath hitching with frantic wet gasps. "They are taking my car, Maya. They are taking the SUV right out of my driveway. The neighbors are outside watching us. Mr. Henderson from across the street is standing on his front porch staring at me in his bathrobe. Mrs. Gable is watering her lawn and just watching us get towed. Make them stop, Maya. You have to make them stop right now." I took another slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich, dark roast coat my tongue. I stood by the kitchen window looking out at the beautiful, clear blue morning sky. I did not interrupt him. I let him spiral deeper and deeper into his own humiliating reality. Jamal was practically hyperventilating now, the sound of his heavy breathing filling my ear. He told me he had woken up early to go buy premium coffee and imported croissants for Brittany to make up for the extreme stress of the morning. He said when he handed the barista his black titanium corporate card, the machine loudly declined it. He thought it was a simple fraud alert, so he pulled out his personal platinum card, and that one was instantly declined too. He said the teenager behind the counter looked at him like he was a broke scammer and told him he needed to step aside for actual paying customers. The long line of people behind him started sighing impatiently. Jamal said he left the coffee shop in a massive embarrassing rage and immediately called his private wealth manager at the bank while driving home. His voice broke completely, shattering into pathetic, ugly sobs as he recounted the terrible phone call. He said the bank manager did not greet him with his usual warm, respectful tone. Instead, the manager sounded incredibly cold and entirely professional. The manager informed him that every single account attached to his social security number had been permanently frozen by the Federal Reserve. Jamal cried violently into the phone, telling me the manager said his business accounts, his savings, his checking, and all of his massive lines of credit were completely locked down pending an active criminal investigation. He said the bank manager actually hung up on him when he started screaming and demanding his money back. "Maya, you have to fix this," Jamal begged, his voice dripping with absolute desperation. "Brittany is losing her mind out here. The repo guys showed up 10 minutes ago and said the bank ordered an immediate repossession of the vehicle because the title is tied to a frozen fraudulent entity. They will not even let me get my expensive golf clubs out of the trunk. Maya, they are towing the car away right now." "What did you do to the trust fund?" "You are the financial accountant. You are supposed to manage this stuff. Call the bank right now and tell them there has been a massive mistake. Tell them you authorized the loan and unfreeze my accounts immediately." I listened to the heavy clanking of thick metal chains through the phone. The tow truck had officially hooked the massive luxury vehicle. I could hear Brittany crying loudly in the background, cursing my name and violently slapping the side of the tow truck until a deep male voice warned her to step back or face immediate assault charges. Jamal was crying so hard he was actually choking on his own tears. The golden child. The man who just yesterday stood in my mother's backyard and arrogantly bragged about his massive wealth and his divine birthright was now reduced to a blubbering, terrified mess, begging his younger sister to save him from total public humiliation. He demanded that I speak. He yelled into the phone, asking if I was there and why I was not saying anything to help him. He told me he desperately needed the $300,000 wire transfer to clear today, or his entire business empire was going to collapse by tomorrow morning. He said he had wealthy investors flying in from across the country, and he did not even have the cash to buy gas to pick them up from the airport. He was completely and utterly ruined. I stood perfectly still in my quiet kitchen, holding the phone steady against my ear. I felt the thick envelope of stolen cash sitting safely in my purse on the counter, reminding me of his ultimate betrayal. I thought about my mother lying in a hospital bed while he tried to sign her life away so he could make his expensive dinner reservations. I thought about him breaking into her safe and throwing our family history onto the dirty floor like absolute garbage. He wanted me to fix it. He wanted me to play the role of the dutiful younger sister cleaning up his massive toxic mess one more time. I finally opened my mouth to speak. My voice was incredibly soft, but it carried the heavy, crushing weight of absolute finality. I told him I was listening to every single word he said. I told him I could hear the tow truck driving away with his fake luxury life. Jamal stopped crying for a brief second, taking a shaky breath, waiting for me to tell him I was going to call the bank and save him. Instead, I took a deep breath and prepared to deliver the absolute most devastating news of his entire pathetic life. I asked him calmly if he remembered the old property deed he stole from the iron safe on Saturday night. The line went dead silent, except for the sound of Brittany sobbing in the distance. Jamal did not answer. I could almost hear the rusted gears turning in his panicked brain as he tried to figure out how I knew about the midnight burglary. His heavy breathing started again this time, sounding more like a trapped, frantic animal than an arrogant businessman. The stage was perfectly set for the final act. I asked him if he thought I was stupid. I asked him if he really believed he could break into the house in the middle of the night, crack a safe, and walk away with a piece of paper that would magically solve all of his financial problems. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute perfection. I pictured him standing in his expensive, paved driveway, watching his luxury SUV being strapped to the back of a dirty commercial tow truck, his mind desperately trying to process my words. Maya, what are you talking about? He stammered, his voice shaking so violently I could barely understand him. I told him I knew everything. I told him I watched him and Brittany on the hidden cameras. I watched him pull the manila envelope out of the safe. I watched him log onto a public Wi-Fi network and upload the scanned documents to a predatory lending agency. I even watched him forge our sick mother's signature on the digital promissory note for a $300,000 bridge loan. Jamal let out a pathetic whimpering sound. It was the sound of a man watching his entire universe collapse in real time. He tried to sound tough, trying to muster a shred of his old arrogant authority. He told me it did not matter what I saw on some hidden camera because the loan was already approved and the money was supposed to be his. He yelled that he had the deed and the collateral was solid. He said the bank was just making a stupid technical error and that once he yelled at the right vice president, everything would be unfrozen. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a laugh born from years of watching him take advantage of my mother, and it felt incredibly light. Jamal, I said slowly, making sure he heard every single syllable clearly. That deed you stole was printed 7 years ago. It is an outdated, worthless piece of paper. It has absolutely zero legal standing anywhere in this country. You used a dead document to secure a live loan. I heard Brittany stop crying in the background. She was suddenly listening very closely. Jamal was breathing heavily, panting into the microphone. "What do you mean, a dead document?" he demanded. "Mom owns the house. Her name is on the deed. I saw it with my own eyes." I took a sip of my coffee, looking out over the city skyline. "No, Jamal," I said calmly. "Mom has not owned that house for over 2 years. 2 years ago, when you started draining her retirement accounts to pay for your fake startup company, I stepped in. I hired a private estate lawyer and we sat down with Mom to protect her remaining assets from you. We created an irrevocable trust. We legally transferred the ownership of the legacy property out of her name and directly into the trust. The deed you stole was voided the moment the trust was signed and recorded with the county clerk. You did not steal a valuable asset, Jamal, you stole a worthless piece of trash." The absolute silence that followed was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. I could practically feel the crushing weight of reality slamming into his chest. In the United States, an irrevocable trust is a legally binding fortress. Once an asset is placed inside, it cannot be removed, altered, or borrowed against without the explicit permission of the designated trustee. And Jamal did not know who the trustee was yet. "So who owns it?" He whispered, his voice entirely hollow. "Who controls the trust, Maya?" I smiled, tracing the rim of my coffee mug. "I do, Jamal. I am the sole legal trustee of the Evelyn Williams Irrevocable Trust. I control the house, I control the land, and I control the equity. Mom cannot give you the house even if she wanted to, and you certainly cannot use it as collateral for a high-risk loan. The bank ran the final title check this morning when the wire transfer was supposed to clear. They discovered that the collateral you provided does not legally belong to the person whose signature you forged. They discovered that you tried to defraud a financial institution out of $300,000 using fake documents." He let out a sudden sharp gasp. The realization was finally dawning on him. He was not just broke. He had not just lost his car and his credit cards. He had triggered a massive automated fraud response within the federal banking system. "You set me up!" he screamed, his voice cracking in complete agony. "You knew I took the deed and you just let me do it. You let me apply for the loan, you evil, vindictive witch. You did this to me." "I did not set you up, Jamal," I replied, my voice dripping with cold, analytical logic. "You broke into a house that does not belong to you. You stole documents that do not belong to you. You forged a signature and lied to a bank all on your own. I did not force you to be a greedy, arrogant thief. I just sat back and watched you do what you have always done. The only difference is that this time you tried to steal from an entity that I legally control, and I do not forgive debts like our mother does." Brittany started screaming in the background again. But this time she was not screaming at the tow truck driver. She was screaming directly at Jamal. She was calling him a liar and a complete failure. She was shouting that he told her he was the golden child, the sole heir to the family fortune, and that he had everything completely under control. She realized in that exact moment that her wealthy, powerful husband was actually just a pathetic, broke fraud who was about to go down for a major federal crime. I could hear him begging her to calm down, promising her he would call some investors and fix the mess, but she was having none of it. The sound of her expensive heels stomping away on the pavement echoed through the phone. Maya, please, Jamal begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic, whimpering whisper. Please, you have to call the bank. You have to tell them you gave me permission. Tell them you authorized the loan as the trustee. If you do not clear this up, they are going to arrest me, Maya. The Federal Reserve does not play around with wire fraud. I will lose the company. I will lose Brittany. I will go to federal prison. Please, Maya, you are my little sister. You have to save me. I stood in my warm kitchen holding the phone and remembering the cruel smirk on his face at the cookout. I remembered him bragging about his divine birthright and telling me to take a pathetic $2,000 and put our mother in a cheap nursing home. He had felt so powerful when he thought he held all the cards. Now that the deck was entirely in my hands, he was suddenly remembering that we were family. I took a deep breath, letting the sweet smell of the morning coffee fill my lungs. I told him that I was just a simple forensic accountant pushing meaningless spreadsheets all day, and that I possessed absolutely no power to stop a federal investigation once the digital tripwires had been crossed. I told him that the authorities were already reviewing the camera footage from the burglary, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to save him. I listened to the heavy silence on the other end of the line. Jamal was no longer screaming. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, like a man who had just realized he was drowning in the middle of the ocean, and there was absolutely no one left to throw him a lifeline. I decided to break down the exact mathematical reality of his complete destruction for him, since he always claimed to be such a brilliant financial visionary. I told him to listen very closely to me, because this was the single most important legal lesson he was ever going to receive in his entire life. I explained the law to him with the cold, clinical precision of a federal prosecutor. I told him that when he decided to bypass a local neighborhood credit union and apply for a massive bridge loan through a commercial online predatory lender, he fundamentally elevated his petty family theft to a massive federal level. I walked him slowly through the exact sequence of his crimes, making sure he understood the gravity of every single mistake he had made. Step 1 was the physical burglary of my mother's house in the middle of the night to steal a voided property deed. Step 2 was the deliberate forgery of her signature on a digital promissory note while she was lying unconscious on a hospital ventilator. But step 3 was the fatal blow that sealed his fate forever. I told him that the absolute second he hit the submit button on that loan application, he transmitted fraudulent financial documents across state lines using a public internet connection. In the strict eyes of the United States federal government, that specific digital action constitutes federal wire fraud. It is a major Class C felony. I heard him swallow hard through the phone speaker, the sound echoing loudly in my ear. Then I explained the bank fraud component. I told him that intentionally lying to a federally insured financial institution to aggressively secure $300,000 using a collateral asset he did not legally own carries a maximum penalty of 30 years in federal prison and a financial penalty of up to $1 million per count. Jamal started to cry again, but it was a quiet, pathetic, whimpering sound. He whispered that he was just trying to save his failing company and that he fully intended to pay every single penny of the money back once his mysterious real estate investments cleared. He said he was not a real criminal like the dangerous people shown on the evening news. He told me he was a good person, a respectable businessman who just made a temporary bad decision because of the extreme financial stress he was under. He actually tried to blame the pressure of maintaining a wealthy lifestyle for Brittany as the sole reason he broke into the safe. I did not let him finish his pathetic, desperate excuses. I cut him off sharply and told him that federal judges do not care about his fake investors or his self-inflicted extreme stress. They do not care that he was the golden child of our family who was used to getting whatever he wanted. The federal judicial system operates entirely on hard documented evidence, and the facts were completely stacked against him in a mountain of digital data. I reminded him that he did not just make a silly random mistake. He meticulously premeditated a financial heist against his own mother while she was fighting for her life. He planned it, he executed it, and he bragged about it loudly at a family barbecue in front of 30 witnesses who all heard his arrogant confession. I told him the Federal Bureau of Investigation was not going to send a polite warning letter asking for a friendly explanation. They were going to freeze every single asset associated with his Social Security number to recover the fraudulent funds. I told him the humiliating repossession of his luxury SUV was just the very beginning of his absolute nightmare. The commercial bank was going to legally seize his company accounts and shut down his entire business operation permanently. Brittany's shiny platinum credit cards were never going to work again. Their expensive rented penthouse would be next because the wealthy landlord would automatically run a background check when the monthly rent check bounced and discover the massive federal indictment attached to his name. I painted a vivid, highly detailed picture of his immediate grim future. I told him he was going to quickly lose the tailored velvet suits and the heavy imported watches. He was going to lose the fancy steakhouse dinners and the exclusive VIP tables at the downtown nightclub. He was going to lose the absolute only thing he ever truly cared about, which was his fake, wealthy image. And once the stolen money and the glittering image were completely gone, he was going to lose his wife. I told him that Brittany was highly superficial and would never stand by a broke convicted felon who could not even afford to buy her a simple cup of coffee. She was going to quickly pack her expensive designer bags and leave him rotting in a federal holding cell before the sun even set today. "Maya, please stop!" he sobbed, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "Please stop saying these terrible things. You are my sister. We share the exact same blood. You are supposed to protect me from things like this." I felt a brief, sharp flash of absolute disgust. He only remembered our blood tie when he was backed completely into a corner with a massive federal target painted on his back. I told him that sharing blood does not give anyone a free pass to emotionally abuse and financially exploit people. I told him that for my entire life I had quietly watched him manipulate our loving mother, taking everything she had to offer and giving absolutely nothing but lies and deep disrespect in return. I told him that just 2 days ago he looked at me and called our mother dead weight. He said she was a massive burden and that he was completely done carrying her. I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out for a few long seconds to make sure my next words hit his fragile ego with maximum crushing impact. I told him that I actually completely agreed with his earlier assessment. I told him it was finally time to cut the useless dead weight out of our lives once and for all. But the dead weight was never our mother. The dead weight was him. He begged me one last time to call my private lawyer and stop the bank from pressing federal charges. He promised he would sign any legal document I wanted him to sign. He promised he would never ever ask our mother for another dime. He promised he would instantly change his ways and be the loving brother I always wanted. I took a final slow sip of my coffee, looking down at the perfect heart shape drawn in the steamed milk. I told Jamal that it was far too late for his empty, hollow promises. The automated banking alarms had already been tripped and could not be reversed. The digital evidence was already securely in the hands of the federal authorities. The trap had closed permanently, and there was absolutely no key to open it. I told him to put on his absolute best designer suit and go sit on the curb outside his empty paved driveway, because the federal agents were probably already on their way to his house right now to put him in handcuffs. I did not wait for his response. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red button, and ended the call. I did not have to be in his expensive neighborhood to know exactly how the rest of his morning played out. The intricate details of his absolute downfall were eventually captured by the official police reports, the neighborhood gossip, and the high-definition security camera footage from the houses across the street. After I ended our call, Jamal stood completely frozen in his empty driveway, staring at the blank screen of his phone. His luxury SUV was already gone, and the quiet suburban street was perfectly still around him. He slowly walked back inside the rented penthouse, leaving the heavy, custom mahogany front door slightly ajar. He collapsed onto the expensive Italian leather sofa, burying his face in his trembling hands. Brittany was pacing the massive living room, violently chewing on her manicured nails. She kept asking him what I had said, and when the bank manager was going to release their frozen funds. Jamal could not even form a coherent sentence. He just sat there rocking back and forth, waiting for the inevitable consequences of his massive ego. He did not have to wait very long. Exactly 20 minutes after I hung up the phone, 3 dark, unmarked sedans turned onto his pristine street. They did not use blaring sirens or flashing red lights. They moved with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of the federal government. The vehicles parked aggressively, blocking the bottom of the long paved driveway. 5 tall agents stepped out wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across the back. They walked up the concrete walkway, their heavy boots crunching loudly against the pristine landscaping. Brittany saw them through the massive front bay window, and her face drained of all color. She actually thought they were just local police coming to take a report about the illegally towed car. She had absolutely no idea that the federal hammer was about to drop directly on her luxurious artificial life. The lead agent did not politely ring the doorbell. He pounded on the heavy wooden door with his closed fist. The sound echoed through the massive house like a terrifying death knell. Jamal flinched violently on the couch, but he could not force his weak legs to stand up. Brittany marched to the door and pulled it open, ready to scream at whoever was making such an obnoxious noise and ruining her morning further. The lead agent immediately held up his golden shield and stated his name and his agency. He asked to speak with Jamal Williams. Brittany took a step back, her eyes darting frantically between the 5 serious men standing on her front porch. She crossed her arms defensively and demanded to know what this sudden intrusion was all about. The agent did not sugarcoat a single word for her. He pulled a thick folded document from his inner jacket pocket and calmly stated that they were serving a federal arrest warrant for multiple felony counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. The heavy words hung in the air, suffocating and absolute. Brittany stared blankly at the arrest warrant and then slowly turned her head to look at Jamal, who was still sitting on the leather sofa, shaking uncontrollably. The grand illusion completely shattered in that exact millisecond. The wealthy, successful entrepreneur she thought she had married was suddenly exposed as a pathetic, broke criminal who was about to spend decades rotting in a federal penitentiary. The panic in Brittany's eyes instantly vanished and was completely replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She did not rush to her husband's side to comfort him. She did not ask the federal agents for a moment to call a defense lawyer. She looked right through Jamal as if he were a disgusting piece of garbage rotting on her expensive imported rug. Brittany turned quickly on her heel and sprinted up the floating glass staircase. The federal agent stepped into the grand foyer, keeping a very close eye on Jamal, who was now weeping openly into his hands. Upstairs, the frantic, chaotic sounds of wooden drawers being ripped open and metal hangers being violently shoved aside echoed through the empty, cavernous house. Jamal finally found a tiny ounce of strength to stand. He stumbled awkwardly toward the staircase, crying out to his wife, begging her to wait and just listen to him explain. He slowly dragged himself up the glass stairs, his velvet tuxedo jacket hanging loosely and pathetically on his slumping shoulders. When he reached the master bedroom, he found Brittany frantically shoving her most expensive designer dresses and heavy velvet jewelry boxes into 3 massive luxury suitcases. She was moving with chaotic, frantic energy, completely ignoring his pathetic, desperate pleas. Jamal fell to his knees right in the doorway of the master bedroom. He reached out and grabbed the hem of her expensive silk dress, sobbing hysterically like a terrified child. He begged her not to leave him all alone. He told her he did this entire horrible thing just for her to give her the beautiful, wealthy life she constantly demanded. He promised he would somehow hire a brilliant defense attorney and fix this massive misunderstanding. Brittany stopped packing and looked down at him. The sweet, supportive mask she had worn for 3 long years finally slipped away, completely revealing the deeply ugly, racist core of her true personality. She violently kicked her leg, breaking his weak grip on her dress. She looked down at the desperate man who had cruelly abandoned his own sick mother for her, and she unleashed a torrent of pure vicious venom. She called him a pathetic ghetto scammer. She screamed that he was a total failure who could never truly escape his dirty lower-class roots, no matter how many tailored suits he bought. She yelled horrible, unforgivable racial slurs right to his face, telling him she was completely disgusted that she ever let a broke street thug touch her pristine skin. She said he was nothing but a fake and a complete fraud, and that he had completely ruined her perfect reputation in their wealthy social circle. Jamal kneeled on the expensive plush carpet, clutching his chest as the woman he worshipped verbally ripped his soul to absolute shreds. He sobbed even harder, begging her to stop calling her his beautiful angel and his absolute everything. But Brittany simply zipped up her heavy luxury suitcases and grabbed the retractable handles. She stepped right over his kneeling, trembling body, completely indifferent to his immense emotional agony. She dragged the heavy bags out of the bedroom and down the glass stairs, the wheels thumping loudly against the glass steps. Jamal crawled pathetically to the landing, watching her walk away from him forever. She did not even glance at the federal agents who were waiting quietly in the living room. She pulled out her phone and ordered a premium black car service, yelling at the dispatcher to send a vehicle immediately because she was in a dangerous environment. She stood by the open front door, tapping her foot impatiently, while Jamal continued to sob loudly from the top of the stairs. When the sleek black town car finally arrived outside, Brittany walked out the front door without looking back a single time. She threw her bags in the trunk and slammed the door shut, getting him out of her life permanently. She left the golden child crying alone on his knees while the federal agents slowly walked up the stairs, pulling a pair of heavy cold steel handcuffs from their leather belts. His beautiful fake empire was completely destroyed, and he was finally entirely, utterly alone. It was late in the afternoon when my cell phone buzzed against the smooth granite countertop of the kitchen. The violent storm of the morning had completely passed, leaving behind a quiet and still apartment. I was sitting in the living room with my mother, who was resting peacefully in her comfortable armchair, with a soft fleece blanket draped over her lap. I walked into the kitchen and looked down at the glowing screen. The caller ID did not show Jamal's smiling, arrogant contact photo or Brittany's demanding text messages. It was an unknown number, but the location tag indicated it was calling from a federal detention center downtown. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I picked up the heavy device and walked slowly back into the living room, standing right next to my mother's chair. I swiped my thumb across the screen to accept the call. The automated, robotic voice of the federal prison system immediately announced that I was receiving a collect call from an inmate at the federal holding facility. It asked me to press 1 to accept the charges. I pressed the button, and the line clicked open, connecting me to the absolute bottom of my brother's massive downfall. The voice that came through the small speaker was completely unrecognizable. The booming, arrogant tone that had loudly bragged about his divine birthright in the backyard just a day ago was entirely gone. It was replaced by the wet, choking sounds of a man who had finally been completely stripped of his fake power. "Maya, are you there?" he cried, his voice echoing slightly in what sounded like a large, empty concrete room. "They took my clothes, Maya. They took my watch and my shoes, and they put me in a freezing concrete cell. You have to get me out of here right now." I listened to him weep without feeling a single drop of sympathy. I looked down at the woman who had given him absolutely everything she had. I pressed the speakerphone button so his pathetic, desperate voice filled the quiet living room. Jamal did not know she was listening to him. He kept crying and begging. He said he was completely terrified. He said his public defender told him the bank had all the digital evidence, and that the FBI was pushing for a massive maximum sentence because of the forged signature. Maya, please, you have to talk to Mom, he begged heavily. You have to tell my beloved mother what happened to me. Tell her I am so sorry. Tell her I love her more than anything in the entire world. Tell her to just sign a paper saying she gave me the house and authorized the loan. She is my mother, Maya. She will forgive me because she always forgives me. I looked closely at Evelyn. Her tired eyes were wide open, staring directly at the phone resting in my hand. There were absolutely no tears falling down her cheeks today. The heavy dark veil of manipulation had finally been completely lifted from her mind. She heard the absolute hollow desperation in his voice, and she finally understood the cold, hard truth. He did not love her. He never truly loved her. He only loved the money and the resources he could violently extract from her. When he had the stolen deed, he called her a burden and threw her precious memories in the dirt. Now that he was wearing a federal jumpsuit facing decades in prison, she was suddenly his beloved mother again. I leaned slightly closer to the microphone. Jamal, I said softly. Mom is sitting right here. She is listening to every single word you are saying. The line went completely silent for a long, agonizing moment, except for the sound of his heavy, panicked breathing. Mom? He whispered, his voice trembling with sheer terror. Mom, please help me. I did it for us. I was just trying to build a massive legacy for our family. Please do not let them lock me away in this horrible freezing place. Mom, please say something to me. My mother looked up at me. She took a slow, deep breath, filling her lungs with the quiet, peaceful air of my apartment. She reached out her frail hand and gently touched my arm. She gave me a single firm nod. She was finally giving me the ultimate permission to end the cycle of abuse. She was completely done being his victim. I looked back at the phone. Jamal. I said, my voice completely steady and cold like ice. 2 days ago, Mom was lying on the floor having a massive heart attack. Her lips were turning blue and she was fighting for her life. I called you begging for your help to drive her to the hospital. Do you remember exactly what you told me while you were drinking expensive champagne and laughing with your wealthy fake friends? Jamal started to sob uncontrollably, pleading with me to stop talking. He knew exactly what was coming. But I was not going to stop. I was going to hold up the heavy mirror of reality and force him to look at the absolute monster he had chosen to become. I repeated his exact words slowly and clearly, making sure each syllable struck him like a physical blow. She is dead weight. Not my problem. Figure it out yourself. I let those horrible, cruel words hang in the air for a few long seconds, letting them completely destroy the last tiny shred of hope he had left in his pathetic heart. Then I reached down and pressed the red button ending the call. The room fell perfectly silent again. The long, bitter reign of the golden child was officially over forever. 6 months later, the cool, crisp autumn breeze drifted through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of our brand-new luxury penthouse. I stood by the thick glass looking out over the sprawling city skyline, watching the tiny cars move like busy ants on the streets far below. The federal investigation had completely and ruthlessly dismantled Jamal's fake empire. The courts seized absolutely everything he owned to pay back his massive fraudulent debts. The predatory lending firm immediately dropped their illegal claim on the legacy property once my private attorney presented the airtight, irrevocable trust documents to a federal judge. Jamal was currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary, beginning a very long sentence for wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Brittany filed for divorce the very next week, taking whatever loose cash she had hidden away and completely disappearing from his life, just like I knew she would. The justice system had done its job perfectly, but the real true victory was right here in this beautiful, quiet room. I turned around and looked at my mother. She was sitting at our custom marble dining table pouring hot water from a heavy silver kettle into 2 delicate porcelain teacups. The dark, exhausting circles under her eyes were completely gone. The heavy crushing weight of constant anxiety and financial abuse had been permanently lifted from her fragile shoulders. We had sold the old legacy property a few months ago. It was just too full of painful memories and bitter toxic ghosts. Instead of selling it to a greedy corporate developer, we sold it to a young, hardworking family who promised to love the old oak tree in the backyard. The irrevocable trust had then purchased this stunning penthouse outright, giving us a safe, elevated sanctuary far above the noise and the chaos of our dark past. I walked over and sat down next to her, taking the warm porcelain teacup in my hands. The fragrant, sweet smell of jasmine tea filled the bright, sunny room. We sat in comfortable, peaceful silence for a long time, simply enjoying the deep, profound peace that comes from absolute freedom. Family is an incredibly complicated word. Society constantly tells us that blood is the absolute strongest bond in the world, and that we are morally obligated to forgive the people who share our DNA, no matter how many times they intentionally hurt us. But as a forensic accountant, I know for a mathematical fact that you cannot balance a ledger that is constantly bleeding. Blood relatives can sometimes be your absolute worst enemies, because they know exactly where all your softest vulnerabilities are hidden. Jamal used my mother's unconditional love as a sharp weapon to slowly destroy her. He thought his given title as the eldest son gave him a divine, unquestionable right to steal her future and mock her pain. Breaking deep generational curses requires making incredibly difficult and painful choices. It requires walking away from the toxic traditions that demand your silent suffering just to keep the peace. It requires building a massive fortress around your own mental health and refusing to let anyone cross the drawbridge, no matter who they claim to be. I looked at my mother and smiled gently. She smiled back, her eyes bright and full of genuine, renewed life. We had survived the terrible storm. We had exposed the massive fraud, and we had taken back total, absolute control of our own narrative. If you are watching this, and you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic, where your love and your valuable resources are constantly being exploited, I want you to know that you are absolutely not alone. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm. You have the immense power to walk away, to set firm, unbreakable boundaries, and to build a beautiful life completely on your own terms. Please let me know in the comments below if you have ever had to make the incredibly difficult decision to cut ties with a toxic family member in order to protect your own peace. I would love to read your stories and support your personal journey of healing. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content about protecting your peace and reclaiming your stolen power. Thank you so much for watching, and please always remember that your true worth is never determined by the people who are too blind and arrogant to see it.